looks more like large stones have been glued to the surface of the building. This is a fine method for your first build, but something I think every crafter should eventually move away from. Next option is the Vallejo texture paste. This is a really good option. It applies easily and quickly, it's easy to control, and the texture is a lot smaller and finer than using sand and glue. This stuff also dries really quickly and quite hard, making it a very good candidate. The stuff when dry is incredibly durable. For the third option, I tried out something that was recommended to me in conversation by my friend Luke from Luke's APS. Unsanded tile grout. This is regular generic unsanded grout that you would buy from any hardware store. It's really cheap to buy. The idea here is that because it's basically a powder, it won't leave any unnaturally large chunks like sand. And the powder itself is cementitious, so once it's activated with water, it will cure quite hard. His recommendation was to simply paint on some PVA or Mod Podge to the surface and sprinkle on the powder. The excess can then be shaken off, leaving only the powder that touched the glue in a very believable, somewhat smooth plaster texture. If I were gonna do this method on my actual piece, I likely would add one second step of spraying down the piece with some water and glue to hydrate any dry grout on the surface and make sure it all cured. In the end, I didn't go with any of these methods. They all had the same flaw. They were too thin for my building. When I constructed my building, I made the timbers about 1/8 of an inch thick. So they sat very proud of my foam core structure. All three of these methods were too thin to look believable, and I wanted something that would fill the area almost flush with the beams. I decided to continue on with the grout, but in a way that was more in line with how the actual material was meant to be used. I mixed up some grout with water to a fairly thin consistency, almost like pancake batter. I could then fill the recesses with this mixture so that it was flush with the beams. Because it was runny, it would mostly self-level. During the test, I thought it was creating too smooth of a finish, so on half of the area, I tried sprinkling on some of the dry powder to the surface to create more of a stucco look. I absolutely loved the results. With my new technique in hand, I set to work applying the grout to my actual piece. To do this, you need to work on one side of the building at a time and lay it flat on your work surface so that the grout can settle when it cures. This is the biggest downside to this technique. You can't bang out the whole building in one go, but I think it's a worthy trade-off. I was worried that it would be difficult to apply in these smaller areas, especially the ones that were triangle in shape. But using a popsicle stick, it was actually really easy to work the product into the corners. Once I had all of the areas filled with wet grout, I went ahead and sprinkled the dry powder over everything. Unfortunately, this didn't result in the same sort of texture as my test piece, so I was forced to improvise and pivot. I let the grout set up for about 20 minutes and then went to work using a flat sculpting tool to flatten all the high areas. The idea here was not to completely smooth it all out, but to just smooth the highest points and leave low areas textured, which in the end created a very believable worn plaster look. I found that doing the other sides after the one I filmed, that if I left the grout to set up for even longer, closer to like an hour, it was a lot easier to do this effectively. The drying times will vary depending on climate variables, but in general, the sweet spot is when the grout has firmed up, but not fully cured. Once the grout is fully cured, it's easy to go in with a brush to clean off the excess powder, or an airbrush is even better. Overall, I'm absolutely in love with this technique. It looks way better than any of the methods I've used previously, and it adds a hell of a lot of durability to the piece. All the stucco areas are now essentially 1/8 thick slabs of concrete, making the walls very strong, and more importantly, adding some much needed weight to the entirely foam piece, because that's one downside to foam buildings. Sometimes they are almost too light. So that's what I ended up